Mind and Matter podcast, where we talk about how what you consume, from food to drugs and ideas, influences who you become. I'm your host, Nick Jikomes, and I have a background in academic science, independent research, and writing, and I'm the creator of the Mind and Matter podcast and Substack page. I got a Ph.D. in neuroscience from Harvard University, where I studied the neurobiology of feeding behavior, and before that, I studied evolutionary genetics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. On normal episodes of the podcast, I talk mainly with scientists, academics, and other experts about topics that interest me as a biologist, ranging from neuroscience to metabolism, evolution, animal behavior, and the effects of drug, food, and biotechnology. This episode is part of a special sub-series where I talk to independent scholars who are often not affiliated with major institutions like universities, but who I believe have interesting perspectives. These conversations are often more multidisciplinary in nature, connecting my areas of scientific interest with subjects spanning social psychology, culture, religion, history, and the rise and fall of civilizations, areas which may sometimes be more taboo, controversial, or outside the Overton window of popular discourse. These episodes are available in full to paid subscribers on the Mind and Matter Substack page or my YouTube channel. If you're hearing this version, you are a paid subscriber, and I thank you for your support. With that, I hope you enjoy the conversation. That happens where time goes by and large swaths of the scientific literature just sort of get forgotten. And, a lot of old studies are poorly done, but a lot of them are very well done. And some of them, including the mouse utopia studies and some other things that are related, no one really talks about them anymore because A, they've literally forgotten they're there, and or B, they're sort of taboo and we don't really like to think about the interpretation. And so Calhoun's work was very interesting for me to go back and read.
That's something I think about, and I don't think of it in the same context that you do, but what I see is that my speciality is the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. And in medieval philosophy, you have these entire philosophic fields that are just completely irrelevant to us today. Mm-hmm. But they discovered useful things, and the best way to understand medieval philosophy is that it's an attempt to reconcile your conscious life as an individual with how you as a person interact with the world on a practical basis. And between modern and medieval philosophy, you had this jump, and we don't notice this jump, from how you as a soul interact with the world on a practical basis, which is what religion was to them. Mm-hmm. And then we jumped it to what is mechanically measurable being the world. And that's a very important jump. But if you read about previous societies, you find that they had entire philosophic disciplines that would probably be useful to us, but we don't have a word for. For example, your idea of scaling up from the body to the nation. In ancient Greek or Roman literature, they had the idea that a nation or a world is like a body. And so their conception of political science was bodily focused, in which each social class was a different part of a body. And so you have all of these different historic things. And your story opened up a lot of different threads that I've been thinking about. And I once had a conversation with a public intellectual, and I respect him and I don't want to have drama, so I won't give his name, but I was talking to him and he said, I told him I loved reading authors around World War II. Mm-hmm. And he said, I don't like reading anything that's older than, like, let's say 1990. And he also said, I don't look at anything that doesn't have data attached to it. And what I told him is, you've literally cut out 85% of human thinking for no gain. And I had a friend who told me the reason you would do that is to prevent falsification. Right. And because if you shrink the data size, no one around you can bring in different forms of information that can counteract what you're saying. And there's a book called Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. And it's about how once you increase the power of feminism, the entire society deteriorates. And it was written in the 1930s. But the way we would counteract never having to talk about that book is saying it was written 100 years ago. Yep. We never have to discuss it.
It's historical chauvinism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I definitely resonate with that. We just assume it's most people don't even think about this because we're in the matrix, so to speak, of our own historical time period where we can't see outside of the bubble that we're in. And it's we assume implicitly that things from the past must be wrong because we have this underlying paradigm of progress, which is, okay, if it was in the past, we must have progressed beyond it. And therefore, we don't need to look to the past because the ideas must have been less mature or even just completely wrong or irrelevant.
Yeah. And I'd understand that more if we were comparing the 14th century to today, because that world's changed so much. But when you're comparing 1970 to today, it's fundamentally the same society. And one of the things that really annoys me is that the 20th century got so much wrong academically, and this is something I think about pretty frequently, and then we've had no reckoning of how wrong we got it across a variety of disciplines, between the blank slate, the idea that tribal peoples are peaceful, the idea that genetics has no impact on the world, men and women are the same. The 20th century had all of these pseudoscience ideas that gained total traction, and we're just repealing them right now. But there was no investigation about, wait, how come with the scientific method, we were able to have pseudoscience take over everything?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important topic. Some people are aware that happened in the 20th century, but most people aren't. And so, you just hear these things repeated as if they're, 100% factual. And it was never the case in some cases.
That's one of the things that really shocks me about science today, where all scientists agree on things like the blank slate. All scientists in this field agree that the blank slate is dead. Genetics impacts history. Human nature is irrational. I've read like 4 books written by socialists that say that this is irrefutable now. Yeah. And meanwhile, you look at the general public square, and no one knows those ideas. It's like hard conservatives who know them. Yeah. And that's it. And
I've noticed that as well. And in fact, it's so... I think, at least when it comes to certain questions related to genetics and things that are sort of in the purview of evolutionary biology, which used to be my field, a lot of it literally comes from really 2 individuals. So a lot of this blank slateism and the basic idea that sort of evolution for humans only occurred from the neck down instead of the neck up. If you sort of read a lot of these people that come at these things from a political perspective, they often cite 2 individuals over and over again ad nauseum, Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin. And I don't necessarily want to get into this for our discussion too much, but the proper way, in my view, to read those 2 individuals, who were very good evolutionary biologists and even more importantly, very talented writers, so they were linguistically gifted, which is part of why they were so powerful, is they were Marxists, and their ideology for them came first. And so they built all of their scientific ideas on top of that foundation.
Yes, exactly. My background's in history, and one of the weird things, because I've listened to like 30 different great courses on history over the course of my life, and the great courses are always done by university professors, and one of the patterns you find, it's become a joke between my manager and I, because we both heard it independently so many times, is the professor will say, historians are generally in agreement about this, except Marxist historians. And that's a line we've heard dozens of times, because there's always this generally acknowledged truth, and the Marxists say something different based on their paradigm of reality. And and they're just fundamentally at odds. And I think there's lots of philosophic points in our society implicit to the science we have that people really need to dig into. And one of the very important points is that Marx was writing before Charles Darwin, and a lot of Marx's worldview makes sense in a pre-Darwinistic worldview. But once you throw Darwin into the mix, it creates a whole bucket of issues that Marxist-derived philosophies, and Marxist-derived philosophies are much bigger than people realize. They're much bigger than Marxism itself. That the Marxist-derived philosophies have had no kind of reckoning with the impact of Darwinism, because when Marx was writing, he was still operating in a fundamentally Christian Abrahamic worldview, where progress is being ordained by God to gradually improve the world, all humans are the same and children of God, and all these Christian values like equality are good. Then Darwinism shows up. Darwinism says the world is chaos, the strongest breed more and survive.
And there's no preordained direction towards which we're moving.
And I think a tremendous amount of academia today is an attempt by the Marxists to throttle Darwinism because they're subconsciously aware that once the Darwinist bull is out of the pen, they don't know how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's very true. Going back to what you said about medieval philosophy, I think it's interesting that you said there was this notion that nations or cultures were sort of like bodies. And so the book I mentioned earlier called Scale was written by a man named Jeffrey West, who I had on an early podcast. And to summarize it very briefly, he looks at scaling laws between bodies, like animals, cities, literally cities, and companies. And basically, one of the questions he asks is, okay, why are we mortal? Why do we die? Why is, like, when you look at an animal development, we have growth and then we plateau and then we inevitably senesce and die off. And there's a very predictable relationship with that. And one of the things he points out is this has a lot to do with the way that metabolism scales with body size. And being a physicist, it gets pretty quantitative, but there's a sublinear scaling law that you can basically plot like all animals on. And this is why, mice live for a little bit of time and they need to sleep all day and their heart beats really fast, but a whale and a tortoise or a human live much longer. It's because basically there's economies of scale with how the physical biological networks in bodies work, such that the metabolism basically kind of like slows down faster than you would expect as you scale up body size. And so, like, the beats per minute of a whale heart are just so much less. And so if even if a mouse and a whale have the same number of heartbeats in their lifetime, the whale's lifetime will be much, much larger due to these economies of scale that come with the higher body size. And what's interesting about all of that is he notices that companies obey the same type of scaling laws, and companies like organisms are finite. They grow and then they die, and there's really no such thing as an immortal company. But in contrast, cities can be immortal. So, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still with us today. Even though we dropped hydrogen bombs on them, it has to do with the way that networks are set up in them and they scale differently. But one thing he doesn't touch on that I think was interesting with what you said about medieval philosophy is the difference between a city and a culture, because obviously cultures do come and go and they do die. And I wonder if there's some connection there with his work and this notion that cultures do live and die, and they are in some sense like a living organism in the way that they're composed and the way that they are finite.
You tapped into a Spenglerian concept, where Spengler said that, for those that don't know, Oswald Spengler was a German thinker about a century ago. He is one of the worst writers I have ever read in my life, but his ideas are in themselves interesting. I mean, just for a brief tangent, all of those German authors from like 150 years ago, their editors needed just to cut out 2/3 of their work. Mm-hmm. And it always shocks me that there was a general public who would read this stuff. I've tried to read Hegel, and I have no idea how the general public ever read Hegel or Kant or whatever. That being said, in Spengler, culture comes from the land, and the culture is a reflection of the land. And in Spenglerian philosophy, he looks at how the geography of a certain society is reflected inside its culture. Where in the Middle East, for example, they have this idea of the harsh sun god, or the harsh god, who is trying and not rational. And we think that might be a reflection of the climate there, which is a hot desert climate, which doesn't particularly like you. And so Spengler also said that once a people remove itself from the land, they lose creativity. And I think that's true, although it's taboo to say, where if you look at, one of my hot takes is that Western civilization or the world hasn't really developed any new ideas since the French Revolution. Almost every single idea we have now is an idea that dates from around the time of the French Revolution, whether technology, leftism, the origins of fascism are around then. There's a French philosopher that time period who talked about talked about liberating the third world. You have classical liberalism, whatever, because that was the time frame when the West went from a majority rural society to a majority urban society. Mm-hmm. And Spengler said that once you move from a rural to an urban society, you lose touch with the natural creative core, but it allows you to scale to a greater degree and do more stuff on a mechanical just sheer scope basis. But in the process of scaling, you lose the soul that made your society what it was, and then your society goes into civilizational decline over the course of centuries. And the thing between a city and a culture, and the way I see a culture is it springs up from the earth, like what I just said. And a city it's like you have all these nodes that touch each other and connect again and touch different things. And a place like Istanbul, as an example, Istanbul has been a city for something like 3,000 years. And if you count neighboring cities in the general area, it's way longer than that. Troy is in Istanbul's neighborhood. And Istanbul's seen so many cultures come and go. The Persians, the Greeks, the Byzantines, the Turks, and through all of that, the central geographic node that is Istanbul has kept going because it's not about the culture per se, it's about the nodes, the other nodes that connect through Istanbul through the geography. And so I have a take that New York City will still be a city in 3,000 years.
Yes.
I think there's a handful of cities in America that will still be around in 3,000, 5,000 years. Yeah. Even though I think the chances that there's something called American culture in 3,000 years is pretty slim. I think descendants of the Americans will be there, be a new civilization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Jeffrey West would say too. Like the city itself is immortal because of its structure. Its structure enables it to be in a way that the structure of a biological body prevents us from being immortal. But obviously, what you're saying is like, I almost think of it by analogy with like a hermit crab or something. Like the exoskeleton is permanent to this permanent structure, but you've got crab after crab, generation after generation coming to inhabit it. Yeah,
exactly.
So one idea that I want to pick up on there was that Spenglerian idea that a people's connection to the land is very important for how their culture looks and develops. And, I wanted to start off by asking general questions around, what do you think the relationship is between food and culture, the type of food that's available, the type of things that people are eating, and how that culture develops, right down to like literally the physical and the mental capabilities of the peoples of that culture?
Yeah. This question is going to end up reflecting poorly on our society. I just want to state that. Although it's funny to say that because in real terms, we're the society with the best health and the best diet maybe our parents' generation was better, but compared to 400 years ago, people aren't eating gruel all day to barely survive.
Yeah, I mean, one little hook there for you is one of the simplest metrics you can use historically to just look at the physical health of a population is just things like height and bone density. Yeah, and teeth. And basically, you're right. I think that peaked for us, X number of generations ago, not too much in the distant past, but we're literally getting shorter now.
Yeah, exactly. That's something I've seen, and it does open up a completely different view of history, where did you know that the period between the time of the birth of Christ and the Industrial Revolution, when the average height was tallest, was the European Dark Ages. Yeah. Because that was the period in which centralized governments, and until the industrial world, centralized governments were mostly parasitic. They didn't add value. And so if your government got stronger, it was more predating off the population. And in the Dark Ages, when Europe had collapsed back to a village level, the amount of predation and also population growth had crashed, so that average health and height had gone up. And so that acts as an inverse. The way I see things is that you have, for every different story of history, for every single arc of history, you have two opposing stories. And for this is the civilization versus the vigor story, where you can tell the story either as you get more civilized, things get better, or as you get more civilized, people lose touch with themselves and vigor and nature. And both of these stories are true, and it's whichever one you choose to tell at the time. But to get back to your point, I think meat consumption is correlated with aggression a lot, where if you look at populations that consume meat and those that don't, there are very few warlike populations that don't consume meat, where if you want to look at the world in 1500, Europe consumed more meat than the other urban societies in Asia, and the Europeans were a much more aggressive, virile society. If you want to look inside the Middle East has always been divided between valley farming peoples and herder peoples. And the herder peoples were the meat eaters, and they were more aggressive. If you want to look at the Eurasian steppe, with peoples like the Mongols or the Huns, they ate meat and milk as their main diet. And they were constantly conquering the more vegetarian peoples like the Indians or the Chinese. And so you see this stark divide between meat eaters and non-meat eaters. And then you also see a very stark divide between wheat and rice eating cultures, where rice eating cultures are very focused on collectivism. Because if you know anything about rice agriculture, it's that it requires an entire village to cooperate at all times. In wheat agriculture, it doesn't.
Yeah. You can have a single family farming wheat, but you can't really do that with rice.
Exactly. And so even inside India or China, we've done studies because India and China are bifurcated between wheat and rice farming areas. Inside those countries, the rice farming areas are more collectivist and the wheat farming areas are more individualist.
Yeah, I think, one thing that's interesting is when you think about diets that differ between cultures and how that influences how they interact. So, meat eating cultures tend to be the ones that conquer the more agrarian cultures and things like that. But then also within cultures, I think those are two separate pieces to talk about. If we look at the first one, you gave us some examples, but, like the Mongols, I read recently, there's this book about Genghis Khan. You may have read it, but, it's pretty well known that, right, the Mongols, they ate dairy, they ate meat, they were physically bigger and more badass looking. And, the people that they conquered were these agrarian people that ate basically plant-based farm diets, and they were more sickly, they had worse teeth, they were just less physically imposing. And that seems to be a motif that you see over and over again. I didn't know until fairly recently that at the dawn of agriculture, basically everywhere that agriculture and sedentary civilization started, yes, civilization came from that, what we call large-scale civilization and all of the good things that came with that. But basically, people immediately started getting smaller, more sickly, worse teeth, and so forth.
That's all true. And you brought up inside cultures. And one of the interesting facts I never hear people talk about is that you have four agricultural belts inside America, or America east of the Great Plains, where you have the dairy belt, which is Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, etc. And that area was based off dairy and wheat. And then you have Pennsylvania through Nebraska. You have the corn and beef belt. Then south of that, you have, that's corn and beef. Then you have hogs and corn in Appalachia. And then south of that, you have cotton. And so inside America, each of these geographic climate belts correlates with a different subgroup of British Americans. And we've studied this, where the different subgroups of British Americans genetically have divisions that are comparable to different European countries, where on a genetic basis, you would expect there to be a desert and a mountain range on the Mason-Dixon line. And in America, we've had it. The division between the North and the South has been the division between, do you cook with butter or do you cook with lard? Because in the South, you can't keep butter because the heat makes it go rancid, but lard keeps better. And so you're seeing this diet belie underlying cultural differences inside America.
And, to what extent do you think that the composition of the diet itself is causally related to how people are acting and the culture that blossoms from that? Is it more incidental, or can there be like a cause? Do you think what people are eating can literally cause them to start to behave one way versus another?
This is something where I would need to read a very well-argued book on the topic to have an opinion, because as of now, I don't have enough data to figure out the causation. Yeah. But if someone were to study this topic, because there are a handful of topics that I read it and I'm like, oh yeah, this is brilliant. But I had to actually get through the information, where there's a great book called, and this is an example, I've read like 30 books like this. There's a great book called The Invention of Manners by Norbert Elias. And the thesis of the book is that civilization comes at the cost of losing our biological humanity. And he goes through the evolution of manners since the Middle Ages until the present. And I never thought of that thesis But by the end of it, I thought that totally clicks. And I'm waiting for that on this topic, where I'm waiting for an author to say, we correlated government system with corn consumption. And then we found that even in these parts of the American South that consumed corn, part of an Anglo-American culture, there's all these similarities with parts of Africa or Latin America. It's like the family structure video where I saw someone be able to predict government system off family structure. And I would love to read that book on this topic where people say your consumption of porridge correlates with this kind of religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one angle that's interesting to think about here is you can know on a personal basis, and I mean, it's just true sort of biologically, it makes sense if you understand the biology here, that, the diet powerfully impacts not just how you grow as you're developing and sort of your physical stature and things like that, but your cognition and your mood. A really hot topic in science right now is using basically it's called metabolic psychiatry, which is using the diet and dietary interventions to change how your brain is functioning and what your psychological state is like on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, the ketogenic diet is famously known actually for thousands of years to be able to treat epilepsy. So it's doing something in the brain, obviously. But now, we're starting to find, it seems, that it can powerfully modulate mood. It can be used potentially to treat things like bipolar disorder. And even just on a more sort of mundane level, like people report, and this is not surprising, that, when you transition from, a carb-rich diet to a ketogenic diet, or, diet 1 to diet 2, it affects your mood. It affects your cognition and the way that you think.
I've been on keto like 7 times, and I can personally completely attest to that, where keto, it balances out your mood, because when you're on a grain diet, it's like you fluctuate more, where you get highs and lows. And keto is just stable energy all day. And because you're not having those violent swings. And what I heard is that they've done studies, and keto's effectiveness is varied, but I've heard it varies on a genetic basis, where people's evolution for whether or not they live in winter climates determines how effective keto is.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense to me. I haven't heard that in particular, but that makes perfect sense to me, actually. So for a number of years now, we're kind of like in a golden age. This isn't my particular field, but we're in a kind of golden age of, let's call it like historical human genomics. So, and I don't mean just the deep past, like Neanderthals and extinct species, but, the last, hundreds and thousands of years. And so I talked to a man named Eske Villersev, who's a Danish geneticist who's in this field. And really interesting body of work, really interesting guy. But the one thing here that I think is relevant to what you just said about the effectiveness of keto varying from people to people is that one of the locuses of the genome where you see the highest variability, even among closely related people, so even among white Europeans, is something called the FADS genes. And that stands for fatty acid desaturase. And these are important enzymes that dictate how your body basically metabolizes fatty acids. And so given the high level of variation there and the gradient that you see from northern to southern peoples in Europe, at least, I would expect that they're going to respond very differently to the fat content.
Yeah. I've heard from people who study this stuff that the thing that varies the most across human populations genetically is how you process diet. Mm-hmm. And
that makes sense to me.
Yeah, because that's something that would fluctuate tremendously based off what population you're part of. And I look at East Asians where they just consume so much rice. And I would never want to do that. That would drive me absolutely crazy. But they're a population that's been eating rice forever. And so they've evolved to acclimate to it very well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you could actually get a sense, I think the story of dairy and dairy animal domestication and how that relates to evolution gives a good sense for how quickly adaptations can spread through populations. Because this gets back to sort of these notions that a lot of people have around, evolution, ending hundreds of thousands of years ago and not being relevant for humans in the recent past, which is just not true. If you look at something like lactase persistence, ask why are some people lactose tolerant and some people intolerant? Why is that much more common in certain European populations and much rarer in populations from elsewhere in the world? Well, it's because peoples in Eurasia, and I think like one or two small pockets, like maybe one pocket in Africa and maybe one pocket somewhere in Asia, they domesticated dairy animals, and very, very quickly you see lactase persistence spread through the population, which is, all mammals can digest lactose through the lactase enzyme early in life, but upon weaning, that gene shuts off, and that's sort of the baseline for all mammals. So most mammals are by default unable to digest lactase and dairy products after they're weaned, but not certain human populations. But if you just look at the time course here, you're talking something like on the order of 5,000 years or so, where this gene or this ability, this mutation spread through the populations partially, but not completely. And so it kind of tells you that in a window of, say, 5,000 years, give or take, something can sweep through a population almost completely. And that kind of gives you a sense for like how quickly these adaptations can actually happen.
Yes. It's fascinating you bring that up, because the cognitive revolution must be equivalent to that. Where 70,000 years ago, there was a period called the cognitive revolution. And with it, we found that humans developed the ability to think in spiritual terms, in philosophic terms, in abstract terms, and to develop the concept of a logical abstract. Because that's a concept that's difficult to convey to, I think, an animal.
Yes.
What a concept like a nation or a religion is, or art. And all humans have that ability now, but like you can't find a single human population without religion or art. And that must have been an absolutely crazy change. And one of the things I frequently think about is how many insane stories occurred in prehistory that we know nothing about. And the question I would posit is that over prehistory, if humans evolved so many different genetic abilities, like rationality, ability to think abstractly, ability to organize in large groups, what genetic abilities are in our future that we think are impossible today, but if there's a certain gene for it, we'll end up developing these?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to think about. When you think about, the so-called cognitive revolution, this isn't my area, but I know a decent amount about it. Like the sort of mysterious thing is like, okay, X number of years ago, and people might disagree on the exact number, 70,000, 100,000, but not that long ago, you had anatomically modern humans. And then it sort of seems, when you just examine the cultural and archaeological record, as if one day we had what we would call culturally modern humans, where they're doing art and religion and stuff. And so as you said, everyone has it today. So this is ability that quickly spread and was highly adaptive. But B, the archaeological record, because it's like so sparse and you don't have a lot of time resolution, we can't exactly like see exactly when or where it happened, but it must have happened quickly. And many people have this idea. Many people have converged on this idea. But if you look at the commonalities across cultures, in particular, how they're like myths are, the construction of their myths around their origin, there's a lot of interesting commonalities there. And so if we just sort of take the myth from our culture around the fall in the Bible and Adam and Eve, one way to interpret that story is it's the fall into self-reflective consciousness. It is the story of humans evolving this ability, and how traumatic essentially that must have been when it happened.
So I invented that idea.
Well, I've heard it many times. Bernardo Kastrup, for example, is a philosopher. Okay. I think this is a convergent evolution.
I invented it independently. I remember going through the mental thought process of coming to terms with that independently. I'm surprised that that was something else that other people have come to.
Yeah, and I think you can. I think even like Carl Jung has used to write about this as well. Huh. So different versions of this idea have been there for some time.
Yeah. One of the things I found is that I put the cognitive revolution up with the Toba eruption, and then I found John Haidt also reached the same conclusion.
Yeah. What exactly was the Toba eruption?
70,000 years ago, you had this volcano in Indonesia that erupted, and it dropped the human population to a genetic bottleneck of around 7,000 people. Mm-hmm. And that was the worst demographic point humanity had ever come to. Yeah. And so the thought that I had is that you have this volcano that created genetic bottleneck at the exact same time as this consciousness revolution. And so my thinking, and humans were stuck on these coastal middens around the Indian Ocean. And so I think we hit a really bad genetic place, and then that forced us to push our evolution. And also it allowed a very easy way to spread a genetic trait across the population. Because once you're at a genetic bottleneck, it's pretty easy to spread a trait quickly. And then humanity after that went through its demographic explosion. Because from 70,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, humanity settled all of tropical Asia, Australia, Europe, Asia, and it's crazy to see the human population go from a very small number to just massive pan-continental dominance.
Yeah, in quite a short period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I want to talk about as well is so I want to go back to this idea of the relationship to the natural world and how and talk about the transition from hunter-gatherer sort of life to sedentary agricultural life, and then from there urbanization, and that relationship between how sort of that transition at the societal level changed things like social structure, family structure, diet, and other things, and how that relates to sort of how religious ideas that are centered on, regulating social norms and taboos and things evolve. I'm going to keep it kind of vague and just let you take us where you think is interesting, but there's some interesting ideas there related to the forms that religions take and the size and scale of a society and the microarchitecture of families and things.
Interesting. Do you know Todd Emanuel?
No.
Oh, damn, you should really study him. He's a French thinker, and he studies family structure. And he's the guy, if you watch the video, how you can use family structure to predict political ideology, he's the guy who invented that. And so I'm going to caveat this with I have no faith in any of the things we say about hunter-gatherers. Because if you look historically, whatever society's narrative about hunter-gatherers is what they politically want. Or in the Victorian period, they turned them into savages who are constantly at war and waiting
today
for
they're the noble savage.
Yeah, and then the 20th century, we turn them into these feminist hippies, peaceful, noble savages. And there's this whole narrative about agriculture being a negative choice. And I think everything on this that's being said about this is true. I'd imagine that there was probably facts we're leaving out, because the whole thing of agriculture being negative, I think it plays too closely into our current environmentalist, Mother Nature good narrative. And so I'm waiting to hear some different fact that there was some massive superiority of agriculture over hunter-gatherers that we're ignoring. But I don't really trust anything we say about prehistory. The narratives change way too fast on prehistory. Where 10 years ago there was an Indo-Aryan conquest of Europe that was dismissed genetically, and now we found those peoples make up the genetics of 90% of North Europeans. Yeah. So prehistory narratives change very quickly. I do think, as I said before, that what we say about hunter-gatherers is hunter-gatherers versus farmers. I think the negatives of that switch are totally true. It's just I think there might be a different context. And the negatives of that are people work more, they're weaker, they're shorter, they have more steep, stark social hierarchies. Brief tangent. One of the things is that we talk a lot about hunter-gatherers being egalitarian, and it plays too much into current narratives. I think that's probably true, but there's another fact. It wouldn't surprise me if hunter-gatherers are egalitarian, but under other circumstances, they're incredibly hierarchical. Because hierarchy is just too built into humans that I don't think that we lived without it for hundreds of thousands of years. Because hierarchy is one of the things that's most genetically wired into humans. And if you look at baboons, they do it. Baboons and other apes are obsessed with hierarchy. But we made the transition from hunter-gatherer peoples to farming peoples. And Todd Emanuel does a lot of family structure analysis of tribal peoples, but I don't really trust his analysis for a couple of reasons, where he said that hunter-gatherer peoples have nuclear families. And so his idea is that agriculture gradually created the clan, and as the family becomes larger, it loses innovative ability. Because if you're in a clan and basically every urbanized non-European society is a clan society. China, India, Islam, even like the Greeks and the Romans. And in clans, everyone actually, I can tell you more about the story if you like, but I lived in a clan compound in Peru for a month, where I lived in this clan compound where it was 5 houses in this gated community with this shared grandfather. And this family, they would work in the same businesses. They would have events with each other multiple times a week. They would work in each other's businesses. They would lend each other money and take care of each other. And that's how most humans over most of history lived. And I could tell that it made them very happy. I would not want to do that. I'm not the kind of guy who wants to stay in my hometown and have my family dictate my life. But I can see why a lot of people do it. But once you get that family structure, it shuts down creativity. And one of the points Todd Emanuel has made is that as Asia went through this remarkable change that no one talks about around 1000 AD, where all the Asian civilizations were the most important places in the world before 1000 AD. And then it happened a bit earlier for India, but India, China, Islam stopped innovating past that point. They stopped inventing new technologies. They stopped having philosophic breakthroughs or philosophic discussion, and they became incredibly conservative. And it happened at the exact same time as Western Europe took off from being the least advanced major society in Eurasia to the most advanced. And so Todd Emanuel says that that's due to the calcification of the clan structure, which pushed, because as you push the clan dominance, you're pushing social conservatism, because your parents will force their children to play it safe and have conservative strategies. And the thing I don't trust about Todd Emanuel is I don't actually believe tribal peoples are Western-style individualists. I think because I have a friend who's an anthropologist in Cambodia, for years, and Todd Emanuel said the peoples of Southeast Asia are nuclear families. And I asked my friend, is that true? And he said, no, it's a nuclear family in that you have the longhouse and there are different parts of the longhouse for different families. And I said, that's not Anglo-American individualism. That's a muddying of the terms to make it look like it's a nuclear family, while in the reality, everyone lives under the same roof and cooperates with each other. And I think that's something, and frankly, I don't trust the information on this, because if we're talking about the Dayaks of Sumatra having a certain family structure, I know there's only one author on this. And so we have to trust that this one
person, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for
how often, I mean, in any field you could think of, as soon as you get 2 or more people, they're going to have substantial disagreements.
Exactly. And so when you're looking at like the different family structures of Borneo, I know that there's probably only one author in this field. And I'm thinking, is this one author honest? Are they using the same terms that I'm using? Do they have a political agenda? Mm-hmm. And so I don't trust basically anything we say about prehistoric family structure. And Todd Emanuel also talks about how we've looked at biblical records of 3,000 years ago in the Middle East, look at the family structure. And he said the early Jews have a nuclear family. And reading the Bible, it doesn't look right. I mean, you look at Genesis, and it's these giant patriarchs with these family compounds, and so what I would say, and I took a long time to say this, is that I think that there is a calcification of society that occurs with agriculture, and I don't really trust the information we have on hunter-gatherer peoples, but there's definitely a kind of solidification at the expense of vigor and creativity and that stuff.
Mm-hmm. And so within cultures, so I'm also interested, within individual civilizations, at how different castes of people in different parts of the social strata can use food to control and manipulate and govern other peoples. So for example, at a very high level, we it's very intuitive. Like obviously the king or the leaders of government, the elites, are going to pick the food that they think is the best for themselves. And there will be less of that left over for people in lower parts, lower castes in society. I'm interested in this idea. One hook here for us is, I learned recently something very interesting apparently about in ancient Rome. The gladiators, right? The gladiators were basically slaves, and they were owned by, elite people, and they were investments. So if you wanted your gladiator to win, there's money at stake. And then I learned something very interesting about the diets of gladiators. Now, naively, you might think, okay, you want your gladiator to be like jacked and lean and ripped, and you're going to give him like good protein or whatever. But actually, so Pliny the Elder, a historian from the period, had this word for them, which meant barley eaters. And they did some isotopic analysis in one study of gladiator teeth and bones and stuff. And they were basically able to surmise they were eating largely a plant-based diet that was carb-rich, lots of things like wheat and barley and beans and legumes and things like that. And it was low in animal protein. And when you compare that to some of the historical writings from that period, the idea is actually that the people who owned the gladiators purposely gave them that diet, and it was because it built up a good layer of subcutaneous fat in their bodies. And when you have a nice layer of subcutaneous fat, you're less likely to have nerve endings damage or to bleed out from flesh wounds, and this probably actually made them a better investment, more likely to survive. And I just thought that was an interesting example of how one caste in society can engineer the diet of another for their own purposes. And I'm wondering if you know more examples like that.
That's also broadly indicative of classical civilization in general. And classical civilization is the Greeks and the Romans. And for example, the Roman army had the exact same diet that you're describing, of very carb-heavy diet. And we have stories of Julius Caesar's soldiers in France complaining about eating too much meat. I don't know if that's apocryphal, but it's kind of indicative of the point. And the classical civilization itself was dependent upon olive oil and grain. And let me think through your question. What other eras of history do you have the elite control the diets?
Well, is it a common motif in history that upper classes will purposefully constrain or engineer the diets available to lower classes as a means of maintaining their status?
I would say no, because the thing to keep in mind with the pre-industrial world, this is probably the biggest jump between the pre-industrial and the current world, is that before the Industrial Revolution, everyone was responsible for their own food. And so the government itself was incredibly weak. And so it's, in Minecraft, there's this idea that you need to go out into the world and like build your own buildings and kill animals and that stuff. The pre-industrial world was a lot more like a survival video game where you were responsible as an individual for just getting your own survival. And the government was this external force that protected you militarily and arbitrated legal disputes and did all that. And so the closest equivalent to what I can see for what you're describing is that medieval lords banned peasants from hunting on their land. But that was more so out of the lords just hunting was what they did as a demographic, and they wanted to protect it. And also a kind of ecological protection as well was going on there. And what you're describing, because most people one of the things people forget is that most people in the pre-industrial world were not dependents, where today, as late as 1990, 90% of the population were employees. And now we're at a point where about a third of the population work in the gig economy, but there were very few employees in the pre-industrial world. Almost everyone was self-employed. And so almost everyone was thus responsible for getting food for them or their families.
So, I want to have in the back of our minds what we were talking about earlier around Spangler's idea about your connection to land and how that affects culture and how things are going to change culturally as we become more urbanized and we live in larger scale societies and we're more disconnected from the land. One of the things I want to talk about that's connected to the agricultural revolution is just food surplus itself. We take it for granted today, but one of the things that the agricultural revolution did for humanity and that allowed us to scale up is we could stockpile all kinds of food. We had more food that could support more people surviving. And having food always available is, something we take for granted, but it's something that was very different for most of humans for most of deep history. And like today, we don't even have to think about it, right? I can go to the grocery store anytime. I've got infinite amount of calories basically cheaply available to me at all times. I don't really have to worry about starvation in the modern world. And I'm wondering what that starts to do to people's psychology and their culture. And
yes,
just to tip you off, one of the things that I think connects into this is the mouse utopia studies that I've heard you talk about before, where one of the things that characterizes those experiments is constant food supply that you don't have to worry about.
Yes. I was hoping you'd ask that question, and it fits very well into the video I'm narrating now, which is the Unabomber video, where I go through the Unabomber's ideas. And that's a great point in a couple different ways. And as a historian, I look at certain things in life today, and one of the things I'm incredibly grateful about is the infinite food, because that's something that our ancestors would I think if you took someone from the Middle Ages, they would think that we were a demonically possessed society that was serving Satan, but they would like how much food we had. And so most things in our society don't work, but at least we have the food. That's something I console myself with. And it changes your psychology. And I think the biggest issue with modernity is just complete disconnection from reality. And one of the philosophic issues you run into with people is people think that there is this really stark break around the world wars, and nothing before the world wars is relevant. But the reality is that world where you and your family are struggling for survival against the jungle, we live in the same world. It's just we've scaled it up to the degree where you don't see it, where we as a collective society are all struggling against the jungle together. But we've scaled it up so much people don't see their actual contribution. And I think that's something where the Unabomber was really right, where he said the biggest issue with modern civilization is it's such a big machine that no one feels like their accomplishments are valid or mean anything, because you just clock in your job at a faceless corporation. You've done your work to make sure we all survive the jungle, but it's so amorphous that you don't actually see the results of anything there. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the great issues I've found is that in our society, no one keeps things real, because you're real when you get punched in the face. The moment after you get punched in the face is the moment when you realize, wait, the world is real and I need to stop playing games. But that hasn't happened enough to the people in our society. And so we get stuck in these very elaborate verbal games, these very elaborate status games. And becoming an adult, the most disillusioning thing is that everything is high school. And this is something I've found from various networks I've been in, is that every aspect of life, whether finance, the military-industrial complex, academia, content creator world, technology, finance, it's all high school. It's all based around petty status competitions of who are part of the cool kids club. And that happens in a society where there's no external threat of starvation or war or anything like that, because everything's a double-edged sword where your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness. And so an interesting idea I've been developing for a long time is that our current elite believes in complete social engineering and that mankind is a god capable of controlling reality, which is something, if you dig into the underlying philosophy that permeates our society in academia or whatever, the underlying belief is that humanity is a god that can control reality, that those in power may develop the rules of what reality is. And again, this is stuff they say that they believe openly. And the only way you believe that is that if your entire surroundings are completely man-made, mm-hmm. because you can knock down a building, replace it with a new building. And if you're a city dweller, everything around you is completely permeable and completely artificial. So that's your conception of reality. And so I think that's the negative of modernity, that in a society that's very wealthy, very artificial, very safe, people just lose sight of everything, because in an environment that artificial, you can't be in touch with any part of the world that's difficult or real, and that permeates into art or philosophy or human relationships or having children. And so it's like we're cut off from the milk of life.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's why it seems like the fundamental divide in society, in any society in history, as far as I can tell, but our society is really urban versus rural? Like I'm struck between I can intellectualize this, but it became very visceral for me when I moved, because I grew up in Michigan. I spent a lot of time in rural parts of Michigan, and then I moved to the West Coast in Seattle. I live in the city, but if I go just 20 minutes away from Seattle, the city, culturally it seems much more like rural Michigan than it does to Seattle, even though I'm right here.
It's funny you've said that because I'm from rural Pennsylvania and I moved when I was 14 to downtown Philly. That was a huge cultural jump, even though it's only an hour. And I've lived in a bunch of places. I've briefly lived in Los Angeles, New York, and now I'm outside Austin, Texas. And one of the things that always shocks me is that culturally, Pennsylvania, or rural Pennsylvania, is vastly closer to Texas than it is to New York. And New York City and Pennsylvania are very close. And I think in our society, it's definitely a rural-urban divide. And I think that's really the thing. The two predictors you use for right versus left is rural versus urban and how much agency you have in your job. People with lots of agency in their work vote conservative. People with low agency vote progressive. And there's also masculine, feminine as the third stack, but all these three things correlate very closely into becoming the same variable. And in previous eras, you had different divides where Protestant versus Catholic is Germanic versus non-Germanic. You had the Pope versus the kings in medieval Europe. I don't know what underlied that. Funny. I should really make a video at some point about the political divides of every major civilization, what they mean. So in China, you had the eunuchs versus the bureaucracy. In Rome, you had the deep state versus the populists, etc.
Going back to one of the things you said a moment ago, you talked about how in the absence of an external threat that unites us all as a nation or as a single culture to fight this external force, people just tend to naturally degenerate into petty status games. And we sort of, I think intuitively, we all understand this. We're social primates. We all went to high school, or, it doesn't matter if it's high school per se, whatever your social circle is, right? There's a natural social status hierarchy that forms. Some people are more popular. Some people are considered to be cooler. And we're all sort of jostling to occupy our little social niche there. And I want to try and tie that. I'm thinking largely off the cuff here, but there's some ideas rattling around in my brain that have to do with the food surpluses and some concepts from ecology.
Yes.
So just to take a moment to unpack this. So in ecology, an ecologist will talk about things like the carrying capacity of an environment, which is basically the total population of a given species or the number of species that can be supported in a given environment. And a lot of that just has to do with the availability of resources, right? If you've got twice the food supply, you're going to more or less be able to sustain a population that's twice as big. So in the modern world, we've got a really, really high carrying capacity that we've engineered for ourselves because of the productivity of our agricultural systems and the widespread availability of food, right? The carrying capacity, the absolute carrying capacity in the ecological sense is very high. At the same time, because we're social primates and because we are in some sense still mental hunter-gatherers that have evolved to live in small bands of dozens to maybe just a couple hundred people, there is, I think, maybe an analogous concept of like the social carrying capacity of an environment. So, and this is going to get into Mouse Utopia stuff, even though the carrying capacity of our environment is in theory infinite because we have like so much food that can sustain such a large population. In some sense, that doesn't matter. There's this other force, which is our need to have a sufficiently high position in a social status hierarchy. And at the end of the day, no matter how many people there are, no matter how many friends you have on Instagram or whatever, you're really only interacting with, dozens or so, on the order of dozens of people in your actual social physical life. And there is a limit that is placed on where people can fall in these hierarchies, right? So if you start scaling up the population really big, even though you've got the carrying capacity for that, even though we have the resources and the material conditions required for people to survive in that, there's only one spot at the top of a pyramid, right? And there's only so many spots at layer 2 and at layer 3. And so when you create these huge surpluses of population due to the abundance of food and things like that, you can have large populations, and yet you're going to increase over time the proportion of people that don't feel like they fit in, because there really is an absolute limit to the number of people that can occupy those top slots in society. And
yes,
this connects into Turchin's ideas of elite overproduction and some of the Mouse Utopia stuff that you've talked about. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are there.
When you started talking, I totally knew you'd end up with Mouse Utopia. I could see the logical progression. Mouse Utopia is really fascinating. And how much of the background would you like me to explain to your audience?
Let's start from scratch there.
Okay.
So these are experiments that were done in the mid 1900s, and I'll let you just describe them from scratch.
Mouse Utopia was a study that was run about 30 times in the late 60s, early 70s, and you had a cage that could hold 6,000 mice, and you drop 9 mice into the cage, and then you see what happens. And infinite food, perfect climate, no disease. And then each time the mouse population hit around 2,000, which is a third of the carrying capacity, and then the mice started to see complete social breakdown. Female mice became aggressive and masculine. Male mice became effeminate and would groom themselves all day. The mice stopped breeding at all. The mice became, and keep in mind, autism wasn't the buzzword it is today in the 60s. It was an actual clinical term. The mice became autistic. The mice lost the ability to socially communicate with each other or maintain relationships. And mice broke down between, there were these homeless mice that would wander around the colonies not caring if they got hurt or killed. You had gangs of evil sociopathic mice who would kill those who continued to function. And you also had the preening, beautiful ones that would just constantly groom themselves, but they wouldn't mate or anything. And so the mouse colony completely collapsed each time because the birth rate hit 0, and then it was complete social collapse.
Mm-hmm. And so just to reiterate before you go deeper, this big arena was constructed, and it's built to house something like 6,000 mice. So 6,000 mice can occupy the space based on, what they knew about the average nest size and the space requirements of individual mice. There was plenty of food, so they never ran out of food. There was no disease, so there was not going to be a pandemic that wiped them out or anything like that. They had the material conditions were there to satisfy the basic survival needs of up to 6,000 mice. And yet what you're saying is when they populate this arena with a small number of mice, the population size would grow, but it would never get to more than maybe 2,000 or 3,000 before things collapsed.
Yes, exactly. And to be frank, Mouse Utopia terrifies me because I've studied every single era of human history, and I know what the way my mind works is I constantly have 4 or 5 different scenarios running in my head. And when I look at because I have no idea what the future is. I always say I'm betting against God, and I take things as they come. And so I have a handful of scenarios in my mind, and whenever I see new evidence, I see which of these scenarios the new evidence fits into best. And the problem with our society today, and this is something I've seen in the last 4 years, because 4 years ago, my comprehension of what was happening in America, I thought would be totally similar to another historic event. You'd have a civil war, you'd have degeneracy, things that you'd see dozens of times before in other societies. But then, since COVID, I've consistently seen cultural trends that are not analogous to anything else in history. And the only analogous scenario to it is Mouse Utopia.
What are examples of things that you don't see analogous things in history?
Yes. So nihilism and self-loathing is one, because the scenario I was looking at is decadence. And decadence is a natural historic process that occurs to every single civilization, whether the Greeks, the Indians, the Romans, the Chinese, the French, etc. And decadence is society gets wealthy enough that it loses its values. It stops having interest in war or children or art. The upper classes oppress the lower classes. The social ties break down. And again, this occurs in dozens of societies. And decadence is happening, but it's something else. Where the Romans or the Chinese or the Indians or the Arabs, they never experienced the self-loathing or the suicide that we have now. The West's active desire for suicide today is something.
And do you mean that literally, like the suicide rates are much higher now than they were even in those decadent societies?
Oh, so I mean it both literally and symbolically. Although the symbol is so heavy-handed, it's basically literal. Where I think the word suicide itself is a modern word. It definitely happened in the ancient world, but it was a very rare concept. And one of the things that I've been meaning to make a video about, but I need to research better, is the history of mental illness. Because pre-industrial societies didn't have, there's very few records of autism or schizophrenia in the pre-industrial world, but you have other mental illnesses like demon worship, like demon possession, or breaking into dance, or witchcraft. And so, yes, we have the highest suicide rates that we ever have on record now. And the idea, all modern philosophers are obsessed with the issue of loneliness and meaning. And that doesn't happen in the ancient world because everyone's part of a pre-established community and web of existence where, if you're back in the Middle Ages, the concept of meaning doesn't even process to you because you have God, you have your community, you have your village, you have your duchy, and that gives your life meaning. And And so what I also meant in turn is that the only motivations that make sense for the actions our society does are suicide. So this was something I looked at, and I previously assumed all the motivations were some kind of cynical power game, where like I understand the motivations for immigration if they're based off increasing the total population of an area, increasing labor pools, that sort of thing, increasing cultural interchange. But when you're pushing for immigration explicitly to replace the native population, that's not historically paralleled. If you're forcibly deindustrializing the economy, which is something most Western countries are doing now, that's not historically paralleled. If you are pushing the complete collapse of every single value structure, if you're against the creation of families and people having children, none of this is historically paralleled. The Romans at their worst point were never this bad, or the Greeks or the Chinese or the Arabs. And so these are things, same thing with the birth rate collapse, where in previous decadent societies, you did see a dip in birth rates, where this was a huge crisis in all of the societies I mentioned before, but it's not to the scale of what we're seeing now. And I think our era of history has a giant elephant in the room that just screams at us. It's screaming at us while we're playing poker in the corner of the room, not looking at the elephant. Mm-hmm. And the biggest elephant is the population collapse, where it's happening on a scale that is completely unwarranted, in which if the current trends continue, for every 100 Koreans alive today, there will be 4 at the end of this century. And the really scary thing is that the population collapse is happening faster than our fastest computer models could have predicted. And that's really scary because scientific computer models tend to have pretty large standard deviations. Yeah. So if it's happening faster than any of the computer models,
we're outside a very wide range of guesses.
Exactly. Yeah. And when something like that happens, it means that you've got your assumptions about the total situation wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
The only scenario I can see that explains something like that is mouse utopia.
Yeah. And I think my intuition here is that you're right. And I think it's because I'm guessing, but based on what you're telling me and the knowledge I have that's pre-existing, I would imagine those assumptions are largely, let's just call them Malthusian assumptions. They're based on literally the carrying capacity and things like that. But I think what Mouse Utopia shows us is that, one of the key findings there is that the actual population size never gets to more than maybe half of the actual carrying capacity of the ecological environment. And that's because my interpretation of why, and we can dig into some of the results in a little bit more detail as well. My interpretation of why is that, rodents are social creatures, and part of their biological makeup is completely dependent on having certain forms of social interaction, which, their genes are making assumptions about the number and the nature of individuals that they encounter. And when the carrying capacity of the environment is so large that you can sustain a population that's higher than what, a mouse's Dunbar number is, the number of individuals it's sort of quote unquote meant to genetically interact with, you get this total breakdown because their nervous systems, they're put into an environment where the population is so big that it disrupts this training program that their nervous system's expecting. And so they don't actually train up the neural networks that are meant to teach them how to do things like courtship behavior and proper aggression that would enable a normal mouse to survive and to mate and to propagate. And so when those things are disrupted, that's why, another key finding in my view is that the population doesn't just go down, it can completely and entirely collapse.
One of the things that I've thought through, but I've never said on the channel, is I think that our concept of causation is wrong in most cases, where we have this very Rube Goldberg sense of causation. This hits this, and then it knocks out this variable. It's very flowchart. I think the way causation normally works is that it's a chicken and egg thing, where for a hurricane, you hit a tipping point where this air gets to a certain temperature, and that makes the other air also increase the temperature, and you've hit this causation. And you find most things in the world are emergent phenomena, where the stock market is not conscious, but it is reactive and emergent. And what happened with the stock market is that Western Europe, in some point in the Middle Ages, was a large enough and flexible enough economy that this new, basically magical spirit emerged. And if you told the ancients actually had a stock market, and the ancients saw it as this divine force that you had to understand and placate to deal with it. And that's not the way moderns like to view the world, but I think it is valid to view the stock market as this almost mystical force that you have to understand in its own terms. And I think that most systems are active and flexible, and they actively interact with their environment. And so for Mouse Utopia, something very interesting is happening. And I compare it to the fall of Rome, the fall of Rome is one of the time periods I've studied the most. And there are so many theories about what killed the Roman Empire. And it's almost a Rorschach test for what you care about. You could blame climate change, you could blame degeneracy, declining birth rate, changes in military structure, the classical civilization burning through all its cultural artifact, its cultural energy, urbanization. All of those are valid, but what happened with the fall of Rome is that all of those worked together in this combined process that killed the Roman Empire. And so the Roman Empire died across multiple layers of analysis at the same time. And I think Mouse Utopia is comparable in that you attach these different incentive structures at the exact same time, where I think Mouse Utopia is, because I believe that the Earth is a self-regulating organism. And this is something you've probably studied more than I, and I'm just basically operating off intuition, but it would make sense if the Earth is a self-regulating organism. And so for something like that, if there's a species that's spreading incredibly rapidly, like imagine if there's 50 billion humans, just the whole planet's going to suffer tremendously. And so I think for something like that, you build into these ecological switches that once a population hits a certain density, it dies out, and that helps out the broader organism. But at the same time, you also hit different incentive structures inside the population. And so it's partly that once you hit that much wealth and scale, the controls against free riding get impossible. Yes. So there's no incentive against free riding. And then secondly, that what you said, where social coordination becomes impossible because you don't have critical mass time to learn to do all of these socio-biological behaviors that are necessary for propagating. And so what you see is an alliance of these different self-interests, the alliances of the individuals in the self-interests of the individuals in Mouse Utopia, combined with the global Gaia self-interest. And then what gets lost is the civilizational level, or between these two, the total society's ability to function crashes.
Yeah. So you're saying that the reason they all commit suicide effectively or stop doing the things that would allow them to continue propagating is because they're actually doing what is going to be better for the quote unquote environment.
Yeah. Or I think there's multiple layers of causation, and that's one of it. Or I think the people involved are making the decision because it's inside their self-interest. And then on the macro scale, it's what's good for the environment. And what I'd also throw in there is that one of the most interesting ideas of comparing medieval philosophy versus current philosophy is the pre-modern world believed that our minds are extensions of the world, that things like God or astrology or your community permeate your mind, and that our minds are all connected into an ecological system. And so the medieval concept of the church was as a warrior group to protect the psychologies of society. And the church fought off demons and heretics and witches in the same way the knights would fight off the barbarian invaders or warriors and that stuff. And modernity believes in a concept called the buffered personality, that each individual is a rationally cohesive whole, which is not influenced by their surroundings. And this is actually an idea that we've never put any scrutiny on. And then once you think about it, you realize, wait, that's not actually true in any way. Yeah. We're constantly influenced mentally by our surroundings. And I had a conversation with my best friend yesterday. We were talking about, I thought that with everything going on in the world, I thought that I, as an individual, being aware of it, could keep away from it. I thought that I could rationally make the decision to not be influenced by it. But what you see instead is that the events around you are constantly changing you as an individual in ways that you can't really control.
Right. Yeah, and you're not even aware of much of the time. I mean, I want to riff on something you just said. So, like, we have this sort of underlying assumption in our culture, in our society, that we are these we are individuals, that we are these sort of atomized units of, rational or approximately rational agents, and we don't think of ourselves as being completely integrated into our social structure. And with that in mind, when I heard some of your talks about mouse utopia and I read those studies, it started getting me thinking about certain trends that we see mental health wise in new ways. So we can think about the mental health pandemic in general, but a particular aspect of it that I want to talk about is the rise in autism. And so I'll take just a minute to unpack my thinking here. And I just want to say to everyone, I don't know if this is true. This is really just sort of a hypothesis that's forming in my mind, but it's based on this blind spot we have in our society around the influence of our social network structure per se on our individual psychology. And so the mystery to explain is, well, why do we see this dramatic rise in things like autism? And there's multiple explanations that you commonly hear for this. One of them, and you hear this a lot among educated people, who understand things on the psychology and psychiatry side, they say, oh, well, it's just a diagnostic issue. We're just more liberally diagnosing people with autism more than we used to. And that's true to some extent, but it clearly can't explain everything, because you can just see with your own eyes, there aren't many people in their 60s with severe autism that you see walking around. Yeah. There's clearly a lopsidedness to this that shows us that this is a phenomenon that is truly growing. And then, people have other explanations for it. Obviously, there's a whole contingent of people that think it's the vaccines. There's another contingent that thinks it's this, that, or the other. People have all of these disparate ideas about these particular variables in the environment that might be causing autism, but no one seems to be pointing what Mouse Utopia would suggest, which is that perhaps a primary driver of things like autism and perhaps other mental illnesses is the social structures, microstructures that were embedded in themselves. If the population is so big that the quality of your interaction with any given person has been literally retarded. Literally, you're not allowed to interface with people with the quality that our nervous systems are expecting to be trained up with, yes, then naturally you're going to just have social behavior maladies, and that perhaps autism is just sort of a manifestation of the actual social structure primarily.
Yes, that's a great point. It's something I thought of independently, and I'm convinced that no one who invents ideas today reads old books, because if you read 19th century literature, so many of the things that people say are just diagnostic differences are clearly not true. There are basically no people in 19th century literature except for the wacky gentry professor. The wacky gentry, you have this archetype of this guy who hangs out at his, and they were normally church officials actually in the 19th century, and he's obsessed with studying seashells. But that archetype is so much more common today than in old literature. Or the archetype of the young, because I think about a quarter of Gen Z girls don't have an interest in sex at all, which is bizarre because I'm a Zoomer. I know these people. And it's crazy that there's this giant demographic that we don't even have a word for. They're never going to get married. They're never going to date. But Mouse Utopia does explain it.
Yeah, you observe the equivalent thing in mice in those experiments.
Yeah.
And can you just reiterate for people, what did they observe in those mice?
So they observed autism in a lot of mice, the inability to socially operate. They observed a lack of interest in mating. They observed over-interest in grooming and beauty at the expense of actually doing things.
And I would point out, so my understanding is there's different subpopulations that fractionate in Mouse Utopia. There's a subpopulation that becomes completely asexual and uninterested in sex. Yes. Simultaneously, other mice become completely hypersexual, and their sexual interest is not concentrated on certain individuals in the way that a normal mouse would be.
Right. Yeah, and that's such a black pill, because once you bring all this up, I can suddenly see these people, and a lot of them were not demographics I've thought of. Like, the gym rat Andrew Tate types of you gotta like looks max. I had never thought of them as a Mouse Utopia thing, but I realized, wait, they are, because it's not looks maxing to start a family. It's not for a social goal. It's just be a beautiful one. And I'm not against going to the gym or anything like that. Everything exists inside context. And so if it exists inside this Mouse Utopia context, you can suddenly see the horror implicit in it. And we just have so many. I really dislike the baby boomer attitude of everything that deviates from 1995 isn't real. And if you go to the boomer elite and talk to them about Because for Zoomers, I think psychological issues among Zoomers are so bad that they will start to rupture society. And that's, you can never get a boomer unless the very most open-minded to talk about that, where they're just like, kids these days are silly. And when you hit the point where, no, kids these days aren't silly, you have a civilizational level crisis. And I think that's another Mouse Utopia thing, that if this was happening 500 years ago, the church would be obsessed with it. It would create a moral panic as the church would suddenly do all this stuff because they would believe it was satanic possession. And now we've become so complacent that people have no interest in even looking at it. And you're in Mouse Utopia when the society has no interest in Mouse Utopia.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's just, I want to connect this too to Peter Turchin's ideas of elite overproduction as a driver of civilizational collapse, because I think there's a correspondence here, because if the carrying capacity of the environment is so high that the population becomes so large that you're just massively deviating from the group structure that your brain is expecting, right? So like basically, if N is the population size and M is Dunbar's number, N is so much bigger than M that virtually everyone in the culture then is guaranteed to be quite low social status, which is going to drive mental illness, basically, if you're too low in social status. And connect that to elite overproduction for us. And just for listeners who are unfamiliar, many of my listeners probably will be, what is Turchin's thesis of elite overproduction, and how do you sort of maybe integrate that with the Mouse Utopia results?
Let me start this with a story where I was part of influencer world for a couple of years. When I dropped out of school, I joined I would join the organization for influencers and successful young people, and I formed another one in Los Angeles for a few months. And so because I was running an organization, or I was part of helping people who were running it, I've interviewed dozens or very, very many influencers or successful young people. And it was such a black pill. These are people who have big social media presences, they're doing well, and people in tech are comparable. I met a lot of comparable people in tech, and they have stunningly poor mental health. They have no idea what they're doing. They are financially not in good shape. And that was a real wake-up call for me, because when you're interviewing these people and talking to them who should be the top of the food chain among young people, and you realize these people are they're not in a good place, it makes you think, wait, what's happening to everyone else in the pyramid?
Right.
And we're in a society where you can make six figures and still barely get by. And the six figures are the top 10% of income. And so I am going to refrain from fully going into Turchin, because this is a 2-hour thing for me. I have hours upon hours about this topic. But I stumbled into this theory from David Hackett Fisher, who wrote a book called The Great Wave. And Fisher's book is about how you can use inflation to predict social collapses. And so he goes over the last 1,000 years of Western history, and there's 20 variables that when you have them together, you have the Black Death, the crisis of the 17th century, the French Revolution, the fall of the Roman Republic, the Russian Civil War, etc. And these variables include average age of marriage. They include political polarization, religious fanaticism, decline in height. There's about 20. And the top 3 variables that the data scientist Peter Turchin uses to predict these crises, and he uses these 3 variables to predict when these crises happen to the years they take place in. And you run it across many different events between Black Death, French Revolution, 30 Years War, American Civil War, etc., is income inequality, elite overproduction, and average wages. And what happens when those things get too bad? It means that there is a very small amount of good jobs, and basically no one is satisfied with the system, and no one's getting by. And so the general population is in poverty. And you have this giant class of people who are trying to be part of the elite, but they are also poor, and there's not enough slots, because once you hit certain critical mass inequality, it means most people are screwed, while a very small amount of the population has a vastly disproportionate income for what they need, or I think even want. I think a lot of these very, very wealthy people are like, I have no idea what I'm going to do with this extra $100 million when I already have one. And I see the elite overproduction I mean, I see both of those variables all the time, where the immiseration is obvious, where it's just obvious people aren't doing well financially now, and the elite overproduction drives everything. It's why there's so much insane political stuff. It's why people work all the time. It's why people have such stunningly poor mental health. And I wish people were fundamentally honest about this. I wish there was in society, people said that people are screwed, the world's tough, you have to accept that things aren't going to be easy. And instead they just lie about it all the time and say that we're still in the post-war era, where if you just go to college and work a 9 to 5, you'll be able to live a good life.
Mm-hmm. When you think about everything that we've been discussing, so when you think about it from an ecological perspective, like the population's just so big. When you think about it from like Turchin's perspective, there's so many people competing for so few slots. When you think about from an economic perspective and the inflation and the debasement of the currency, there's all of these things that sort of line up that seem to point in the same direction, and it's a pretty bleak direction. What do you think's in store for our society? And related to that, is there any way that you can think of where we could cure or remedy the popular immiseration that people are experiencing that doesn't involve population collapse? Or is that the only ultimate solution?
The thing I'm known for is that I'm the revolution guy. This is one of the first podcasts I've been on in a long time, which isn't about the revolution. And the thing I'm most known for is my prediction that America will have a civil war within the next 5 years, and especially within the next year. And I apologize to any listeners of this channel who don't follow me. We're not going to have time to get into that, but watch the 6 hours of content. And so I like to say that there are two crises that are facing our society, which are independent from the other, but which will hit us at the same time. The first is the demographic Peter Turchin elite overproduction cycle. And I think that's going to result in a civil war in America between the right and the left. And ironically, actually, I have no idea what's ironic about this, but every major society in the world has the exact same issues. You go to China, you go to Europe, you go to Russia, Brazil, Southeast Asia. I sometimes check out Southeast Asian news sources, and it's crazy to see Southeast Asians talk about all the same issues we do in America. People can't get jobs, inequality, just psychological issues, high suicide rates, people not having children, expensive real estate. These are things like Malaysian news talks about. And so this hits every major society in the world. The one exception, which I don't even know if it's an exception because I haven't studied enough, is India. But that notwithstanding, so first crisis is this civil war, and it will manifest differently in different areas of the world. And the second crisis is the population crash in Mouse Utopia. And I've hedged around it in different ways, where I've said that our society's population crash and our equalizer will be mental health issues. I think that psychological plagues will be to our society what the Black Death or smallpox was to previous societies, where the natural order with these historic cycles, it cuts the population down. Over the 17th century, the world's population ended 1/3 lower than what it was at the start. Over the 14th century, the world's population became half of what it was beforehand. And so this happens every few centuries like clockwork. And the Industrial Revolution short-circuited the last crisis like this in the 19th century. But frankly, we don't have the time to have another Industrial Revolution before this happens. And so those are the two crises, the demographic, psychological one, and the Civil War. And the way you fix this, and I don't know how political your audience is, but it's to shrink the labor pool. Because once you remove labor competition, you allow the increase of wages for normal people. And I have an idea that pisses off people across the political spectrum, that I think inequality is the biggest issue in modern America. Yet on top of that, I think socialist measures don't work to fix it. If you look at government redistribution, it's not an effective technique to lessen inequality, because let's look at COVID. The government gave the most money it ever did to the population during the COVID handout. That was also the most rapid growth in inequality because you give normal people money, they reasonably spend it on groceries or Amazon, and then it ends up in a CEO's pocket or the stock of the company.
Yeah, it naturally gets concentrated.
Exactly. And so the only effective way to lessen inequality is to shrink the labor pool or increase productivity. One of the things I'm very grateful about the modern world is that the technological discoveries naturally increase productivity for people, where since the 1970s, individual productivity has gone up 70%. The problem is that the size of the labor pool has gone up 40% beyond that. The supply of labor has grown 40% past the demand since the 1970s, and we've done literally everything we could do to increase the labor pool. We had globalization, we had automation, women came into the workforce, there was mass immigration, and there was population growth. So everything that could increase the supply of labor did happen. And so the way you would do this would be to shrink the labor pool, either by creating protective tariffs, cutting out immigration, encouraging women to be in the home rather than in the workforce, and creating rules against certain kinds of automation. So that's what you would do to shrink the labor pool and lower inequality. But those in of themselves are very politically controversial solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, certainly no one's... those are very controversial. So there's no one's going to be able to come up with a unified political solution that actually implements any number of those without triggering significant conflict, which may very well be what happens.
And I don't get the impression this is a political show. And so I'm kind of hedging. You guys can probably figure out what my political slant is, but I'm going to try to keep that out of this podcast.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessary either. We should just discuss ideas directly. We don't need to label them or anything like that, in my view.
Yes.
So there's a number of things like worth talking about here, but one of the things, so you talked about decreasing the labor pool. You also talked about increasing productivity. A couple things I want to say here. One, even if I'm going to make an assumption here, just as like a thought experiment. Let's just assume that we have some huge technological breakthrough and we can greatly increase productivity more than we have even in the past. I think that would basically just kick the can down the road and set you up for an even bigger mouse utopia situation, because now you've just increased the total carrying capacity of the ecology again, which is just going to end up increasing immiseration even further, because now you have room for more people to have low social status. Yeah.
So historically, you do have a record for skipping secular cycles, where an example of this is the longest time a society can go without experiencing one of those historic cycles I've told you about is 400 years. And that always happens when there's some massive empire that can offset internal demographic issues. So Britain skipped their crisis in the 1800s due to having the Industrial Revolution and their colonial empire. Russia also skipped their crisis around the time of the French Revolution due to having Siberia and Ukraine. Rome went 400 years without a crisis due to just being Rome and conquering everyone. And so you can offset a historic crisis like this for a single cycle. There's no record of skipping 2 cycles, though. And I'm wary of saying stuff like that, because the second you tell that to most people, their automatic reaction is, we're going to do that. And one of the things that I really hate about modernity is the automatic abdication of worrying about things and using a MacGuffin to get around it, where I've told people this crisis is going to happen, but we could have an industrial revolution beforehand, and that could save us. And I'll have to say, I don't think it's without warrant. We have done that a bunch of times, where, for example, the third world should have had a massive famine in the 20th century due to population growth, and then there was the Green Revolution, or we never had nuclear war. But we've reached the threshold where an industrial revolution can't stop this crisis. And what you say is true, that it would make mouse utopia worse. And there are no solutions. There's only trade-offs. People always want to find the answer to a question, but there's frequently not an answer. And My other worry is that any innovation now will naturally increase inequality because the kinds of companies that have the money to push for innovations, basically, we're such a stratified society already that the people who have the money for innovations are already the very most powerful, and thus said innovations will increase their power. And so the biggest breakthrough I could see in productivity recently is automation and AI. The problem, though, is that I know that would immediately go to support the very rich. And maybe there's another society in history where if you had AI or automation, it would promulgate equality. But in our context, it would become the tool of big tech to make them even wealthier at the expense of the general population.
How do you think? So, given where we're at in the cycle right now in our culture, how do you think religious and spiritual ideas relate to, and how they evolve relates to where you are in these cycles? So, for example, if we go through some major conflicts and or population collapses and things like that, is there anything in history that tells us how that might affect sort of how religions evolve, new ones springing up, old ones going away, things like that?
Do you mean me as an individual or our society?
Our society.
Okay, great. So I think the 21st century will be a golden age for religion because religious golden ages are dark ages for everyone else. Because once the world gets really hard, people want to transcend to a higher level rather than being stuck in this ugly world. And this is a fascinating time. And I've got a dozen friends who study spirituality. And what I keep telling them is keep doing this because even if you fail in your life, the work that you build on will be useful for the next life. Or no, it'll be useful for the next generation. Take it. And I think we are the most hyper-materialist society ever. And one of the fascinating things about modern politics is that we are motivated by anti-ideas. The ruling ideology of our society, postmodernism, is an anti-idea. It motivates people through the absence of ideas or standards. And that's really remarkable because that's very rare. And I joke that we are a society where the absence of faith is the strongest form of faith that we have. And that's really a human. Once you get to the level where people are worshiping they have faith in their lack of faith, you know that faith is a human biologically ingrained thing.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited for this because I think we're on the verge of something that's really cool because there are no real ideas or stories in our culture, but humans need to have stories and meaning. And I think over the next century or two, we'll have the development of new philosophers, new ideals, that sorts of thing. And I think there's a lot of potential where, for example, someone could integrate traditional religions in Darwinism. I've read an author who suggests that Hinduism will integrate into string theory. And I think that we'll have to go through a dark period. But at the end of said dark period will be a lot of very interesting innovations that I think will be comparable to the Axial Age. And
what is the Axial Age?
The Axial Age was a period around 500 BC when Confucius, Lao Tzu, Buddha, and Socrates all lived at the exact same time. And so all world religions are either Abrahamic religions or they're Axial Age derived. And so it was this period of history in which you had this giant philosophic breakthrough occur at the same time. And I think modernity does not have the intellectual tools to deal with what's about to happen. If mass utopia occurs, when the population crashes, we don't have a way to deal with it because our entire world is conceptualized or in permanent progress and permanently getting better. What happens when that doesn't happen? You need to develop an entirely new cultural vocabulary in order to comprehend it.
Yeah. And we simply don't have that today.
Yeah.
So when you sort of think about the raw numbers here and you think about population collapse and what the birth rates are where they're currently at, it looks like they're going, these things, we're both relatively young guys. We're going to live several more decades. Do you think that the rest of our lives, you and me, people our age, is it going to be living through the collapse or will it also be living through rock bottom and the bounce back?
If you look at the secular crises over history, what normally happens is that you have two crises bifurcated by 60 years. And so you have the first one, an example, let's use two examples of this. One is Russia hit their secular crisis with the Russian Revolution, and then that's 1920. And then 60 years later, or really say 70, you have the fall of the Soviet Union. So you have two major crises bifurcated in a period of peace. If you want to look at the Hundred Years' War, you had one part of the Hundred Years' War that was fought around 1350. Then you had another part that occurred around 1410. And you had a period of peace and prosperity in between. With the crisis of the 17th century, you had the English Civil War around 1640, then you had the Glorious Revolution around 1690. So the norm for these crises is we have a crisis now, there's a period of bloodshed, then as we're middle and old age, that's peace, and then right as we pass on our mantle to our children's generation is the next crisis. Because Barbara Tuchman, who's a historian, and her most famous book is on the Hundred Years' War, she said that when we read this time period, we're reading about all the battles, we're reading about the plagues, the wars, and she said, if you look at someone's normal life, most of their life is normal and peaceful and good. We're just selecting the bad things that happen to them because that's what's written down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the most dramatic things that, people will naturally be interested in talking about.
Yeah.
Interesting. Is it a common, so it sounds like it's a common motif in history that major religions are sort of birthed and spread after major sort of crises like this, after some kind of societal collapse?
Yes, it's also, there's a handful of variables going on here. So the creation of coinage was what caused the Axial Age, where in the pre-Axial Age world, everything was based on a personal relationship or an IOU, where let's say I'm a baker, you're a farmer. You give me a certain ratio of wheat, and in exchange, I give you a certain ratio of bread. Yeah. And we have an IOU based off that. Everyone knows the IOU system with a coin.
As soon as you have a coin, that's no longer necessary. Exactly. So the social microstructure literally gets disintegrated.
Yes. And so all the Axial Age thinkers like Confucius or Buddha or Socrates, we have them writing about how bad the degeneracy was, where just slavery, sexual degeneracy, wars of genocide, exploitation, people being just casually mean to each other. And then the Axial Age religions developed as a reaction to that. And you develop these religions when you have a big empire, because in India and China, their Axial Age philosophies just became the religions. That's Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism. Asia stopped developing religiously after the Axial Age because the Axial Age religions it served their purpose. For the Greeks and the Romans, there's something that we don't understand correctly, is that the Greeks saw Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras as religious thinkers, and they were prophets of the Orphic religion, which is a forgotten religion today. And we see them as rational thinkers because we're projecting our worldview onto them, and we take out the stuff that doesn't fit into our worldview, where Plato spent as much time talking about the immortal soul and the spirit world as he did about like modern Western rationalism. And the reason that though the Greek philosophers didn't evolve into a religion and Christianity took over the West is that you develop religions in large empires where people feel their position in the status hierarchy is low because it's this continental-sized empire. And the Greeks were still city-states. But once Europe unified into a single empire, that's when Christianity showed up and filled the void. Because the religion shows up once you have this large social organism. And then what happens after that is that the religion takes over society after the empire falls apart. So you first have the Great Empire, then you have the Dark Ages, and then the religion permeates the population even more so. And religions are popular in periods of harshness. And as the Roman Empire fell apart, as an example, the rationalistic philosophy died. And it's funny to look at Platonism versus Neoplatonism, because as the Roman Empire fell, this same philosophy became more explicitly mystical and religious. And so religions benefit from periods of large empires, periods of decay, and also changes in social relations. And I think my hope is that the internet will operate in a similar way as coinage, because it's very comparable, where back in the day, you had to actually talk to a travel agent. If you wanted to date, you actually had to go to a bar to meet someone. You actually had to talk to your neighbors. And today, none of that's true. Everything's through a screen. And I think we really need to develop new religions or philosophies to get screen people to talk to each other. Because that's the only way.
I think the basic idea, if I'm hearing you here, is some kind of technological change happens which disrupts normal social structures. And certain kinds of social structures need to be in place to train your nervous system literally how to behave in ways that allow the society to progress, for how to interact with your neighbors, how to engage in courtship and ultimately start families to propagate the culture and the species and so forth. And so when those social interactions get disrupted, you see degeneration because people literally don't know how to behave in those ways anymore. And the religions then that evolve and spread are those that basically create a new training protocol that teaches people how to behave with each other in ways that propagate a culture.
And a fascinating theme you throw in here is I like to say that each religion answers the question it asks. The question is, what question does the religion ask? Where for Confucianism, it's how do you hold society together? And Confucius reached the correct answer, in my opinion, that family is the training wheels for society, and that someone's concept of what God or the government is stems from the role of fathers in that society. You can use the authority a father has to predict the society's authority system. So Confucius was right there. Buddha is how do I escape the world, and that's Buddhism. And Hinduism isn't easy to categorize. Taoism is how do I not feel separation from the world. Islam is how do I follow God correctly, where Islam is a loyalty-based religion, where it's based around submission to God. And that's something the Middle East has been asking that question for as long as they've had a civilization. And Christianity is how do I face the entire world, where I think a big reason Christianity became the most successful religion is that Christianity's got a weird bug, not a weird bug. It has a weird feature inside of it where it has the ability to categorize information not inside its moral code, because it's based around the creation of introspection through you doing as much as you can, and you fail, but that God loves you. And that concept that you push yourself further beyond even what the moral code of the religion itself says allowed the creation of European introspection. And so each religion asks a different sociological question based off the context of said society. And then it creates a social code based around the issues that in question that society has.
And so I can maybe anticipate your answer, but so, let's just say there's some large scale collapse across civilizations that happens over the coming century. And it precipitates, this kind of pattern where some kind of religious revival is going to happen. To what extent do you think, because, as people are fond of saying, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it often rhymes. Do you think truly novel religions will spring up that answer questions that are sort of unique to our time in history and our technologies and things like that? Or do you think that collapses around the world will enable pre-existing religions to spread further?
It's a combination. If you want to look at the axial age, was that the answer you expected me to say?
Well, I think I was expecting you to say that to some extent, probably something new will have to come.
Yeah. I think it's a combination. Something new will have to come. I think some of the old religions will mutate to survive. And an example of this happening is Hinduism, where what happened in India in the ancient world was you had the old gods under the Brahmin priest class. Buddhism was a reaction against that. Buddhism started to win, and then the old priest class took ideas from Buddhism, created Hinduism, beat Buddhism. So that's an example of a very incestuous religious battle in which in Hinduism, Buddhism is a sect of Hinduism, but Buddhists don't see themselves as a sect of Hinduism. And so the Buddha is a Hindu saint, but the Hindu Buddha is unrecognizable from the Buddhist Buddha. India is the exception. That's one of my rules. India India's rule is that it's always the exception to every rule. But so that's an example of the old gods winning. And I think some religions will mutate and survive. I think the three ones I put up the highest bet on survival are Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. I think those have a high chance of mutating. I think for Christianity especially, it could mutate into something unrecognizable, where you incorporate a new, let's say, American Confucianism, and then that mutates with Christianity, and the Christianity 200 years from now is not the Christianity we have today.
Do you say that because Confucianism emphasizes family so much, and that if we go through some kind of population collapse, which springs from the dissolution of normal family bonds, that we would have to reinvigorate something like that in order to reemerge?
So that's a very smart point, and I see that, but it's not what I was thinking. And the reason I say Confucianism is I could definitely see America developing a rationalistic moral philosophy that's not tethered in religion. And I think like a Jordan Peterson is definitely attempting that. And it wouldn't, I think if something like that didn't clash with Christianity explicitly, I think that it would do very well, because I think there's lots of people in America. So 90% of Americans believe in God, and that means there's this active yearning for spirituality. And I think Europe and America are different in that America is still on a social basis more Christian than Europe is. It's just the Christian social institutions can't keep up with what the public wants. So I could see some addendum to Christianity showing up here, and then that balances out the equilibrium. I think these are some random bets. I think a new religion will come out of Eastern Europe and Japan. And Eastern Europe is going through such a profound demographic collapse that they have to have a hard restart. And they're stuck in the middle of the map where they have to figure things out quick to survive. And both Peter Turchin, the Masons, and Spengler all thought that a new civilization would come out of the Russian steppe, out of the rubble of our current world.
And is that just because that's such like a rich interface between different cultures?
Yes. So Spengler said it's due to Russian architecture. And he said, looking at the Russian architecture, they haven't moved into their civilizational phase. Turchin says it's because there's all these cultures mixing together, and it creates a perfect, ideal frame for a new culture. And the Masons, I don't know, the Masons have esoteric reasons I don't understand for saying it. So that would be a new civilization based out of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Romania, that area. Japan, because I see China going through a massive sociological breakdown over the next few decades. The reason I say Japan, though, is that Chinese society, I think it's a tragedy to see what's happened to Chinese society over the last century, where I've been to like half a dozen cities in China, and you can tell it's a society China is the most modern society in the world, and that it's done the most to strip away pre-industrial norms. And something Americans might not realize is America is culturally a more pre-industrial society on average than most industrialized countries. Americans are more religious, they're more polite, they've held on to more pre-industrial codes like honor or a connection to the land or patriotism. And that varies massively on a geographic basis. In Texas, that's obvious. In California, none of those traits are really there. But China has completely denuded itself culturally, and it's really, the communists really raped their own culture. And I think China is it's going through too many issues to found a new religion. Nearby Japan, though, Japan's the most creative country in the world today, and they have freedom of speech.
Why do you say that? What's the metric for that?
Just look at their cultural output. I mean, it's a holistic thing subjectively, but if you watch Japanese movies versus American movies, the Japanese movies are much more complex and interesting. One of the weird side hobbies.
They're not just making Spider-Man 15. They're coming up with a novel.
Yeah, the anime movies they make are insane. And I've never been like an Asianophile. I've never been like super that into Asian culture just for itself. And one of the weird hobbies that people in What If All This probably don't know is that I love pop music. I'm obsessed with pop bands. I listen to all these different groups. And Western pop really died with Trump's election. We have not had any good new pop bands since 2016. And that's a correlation, not causation. Well, J-pop is way better. And I never wanted to listen to J-pop. It's just, it's a better genre. And so I think Japan has a degree of creativity, and it's removed from what I think will be the horrifying atrocities that occur in China with their civilizational breakdown. So my best guesses for new religions, I think something will develop in America that is a rationalist philosophy, a rationalist social philosophy. I think Eastern Europe will develop a philosophy, and my best guess is it's an extension of Nietzscheism. Then I think Japan will develop a new philosophy. I have no idea what that entails. I think India will develop a philosophy that's a combination of Hinduism and string theory, which is something my favorite writer, Amaury de Riancourt, talked about, that you can find parallels between Hinduism and string theory that are very strong. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know much about Hinduism, but I know from like the history of physics, you know, Niels Bohr and a lot of the old guard that were responsible for the quantum revolution and stuff, they were reading the Bhagavad Gita, and they were in tune with some of those parallels.
And I would imagine that a very significant amount of the most advanced people in physics are Indian. And so there are people who are definitely in both of those disciplines. And Islam's a wild card. I could see Islam having a reformation. I don't really know besides that, because Islam's burned through so many different ideas. I don't really know what's next, because Islam, 1,000 years ago, they went through a phase of science and mental liberalism, and then Islam had its own civilizational collapse 1,000 years ago that no one's heard of. Then they then became very socially conservative. The West colonized them, which created a crisis of identity. They went through a phase in the 20th century of trying to copy the West. Then they went through the radical Islamist phase, and now they've burned through that. And so the Muslim world doesn't really know what it's doing. And so I don't know, but I would guess that there's a reformation inside Islam. And one of the fun facts I've learned is that TikTok killed Islam. Because if you look at declines in religiosity in the Middle East, and this is something Westerners don't think about, but America is a more religious country than Iran at this point. And over the last 10 years, religiosity in the Muslim world collapsed. And I have a Saudi friend who says that like feminism is big in Saudi Arabia now. And there's lots of people who are liberal. And there's even like pseudo wokeness in Saudi Arabia. And so that's a very recent, very rapid change to the Muslim world. And people have talked about Islam being immune to the social malaise of modernity, but I don't think that's true. And people over time have gone through why blank demographic won't experience their birth rate declining, and it's always been wrong. The Catholics, the Mormons, the Muslims, probably the Africans soon, everyone said that they were a demographic that would keep having children and hold together, but Mao's utopia affects everyone. At this rate, in 15 years, there will be no countries in the world with stable birth rates.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I think it is a very fundamental thing. Like we based on how we evolved as social primates, right? Like there is a Dunbar number here that is sort of baked into our brains. And if we are in societies where the population is much bigger than that, it's going to lead to this kind of social disintegration.
Yes. I'm wearing out. Are you good if we wrap this in 10?
Yeah, we can wrap this in 10. One of the last things maybe I want to get on is how you know, I'm interested in this phenomena in our country, in our society, with how science operates and institutional science operates. Because on the one hand, you've got the scientific method per se, which is sort of, you know, what we're all familiar with, or what we think about when we think about like science in the intellectual sense. But then there's also this notion of scientism, which is sort of like, you know, science becoming an ideology. And people there's a popular meme right now where people talk about the science, and some people say it like disparagingly, like they make fun of people who are sort of like religious about their faith in scientific institutions. But then some people really do seem to just sort of adhere to what comes out of the official science-based institutions that are connected to the government as if it were a church. And I'm interested to know if you have any thoughts on that phenomenon here in the
That's
US.
something I made a video talking about the intellectual flaws of science, and I really should make a video just about scientism as an ideology. And the irony is that the science trademarked is not actually what science says most of the time. Where, for example, there's literally no scientific evidence for a gender spectrum. It's a philosophic theory invented in the mid 20th century by Marxists who were using basically language games to get there. And same thing with science is now completely in agreement that humans are genetically different, that different social classes, different people are genetically different. The argument is how much it affects that. And that's a very important argument. But the fact that we've gotten to that argument means that the science has progressed in a certain way. And the science trademarked is really just the self-interest of the managerial class. And so and one of the very strange things about our society is we say that if an executive bureaucracy says something, it's automatically true. And so if Harvard rubber stamps something, it's true, move it on. We don't actually have to talk about if it's true, if the ideas are true. Harvard rubber stamped it. And I like to say that our society is a nihilistic suicidal death cult. However, it put up the facade of being reasonable, consensus, and humane. And one of my favorite authors, Sam Francis, has called our modern ideology consensus liberalism, that you create a reasonable consensus among the experts, and then that is what the ideology of the society is. And it's got a lot of similarities to the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church would have these ecumenical councils. What the councils decided became the new Catholicism. The problem, though, this is something that I facepalm about this all the time, is that our image of science lacks any common sense or intuition or wisdom, where science without wisdom is a mirror for whatever your beliefs are. And every part of the political compass has gone through a phase of saying that their beliefs are the scientific truth. And because they look up studies that validate their own biases. For example, we made it taboo to study the genetic differences between men and women, so the science for decades said that there were no differences. Or people will, there's so many examples of this.
So that's like a negative example. There's a lack of information about a certain area because it was considered it was made culturally taboo to study that. But there's also like the opposite phenomenon where the scientific literature is so vast and dense, and it's populated by such a high variability and quality of studies. There's just studies out there, many of which are partially or completely invalid, but it allows you to just make a collage of whatever you want to support whatever conclusion you already held.
The example I was going to bring up next is the food pyramid, which is really an example of this messing up, where when I was growing up, and I'm a Zoomer, the schools taught us that carbohydrates were the healthiest food. And that's insane, because when I go on keto, I lose a lot of weight very quickly. And that's a no carbohydrate diet. And the consensus now is that carbohydrates are one of the least healthy foods. And I don't trust the given consensus at any time. I think one of the mental models I have is that if some scientific opinion plays too much into someone's self-interest, I'm not going to believe it. And so when you look at like the hyper-masculine, like just eat meat, just eat that sort of thing. And actually, I'm friends with a guy who runs he runs a carnivore business, and we talk together, and it's done wonderful good for him and everyone he knows. And I think the biggest reason the meat diet would help a lot of people is that it cuts out all of the chemicals. It cuts out the various.
You're eliminating a lot of the crap that's out there, and there's multiple multiple elimination diets.
Yes, and the thing that I'm careful about with the all meat diet is that it plays very much into right wing politics of we want to be the opposite of vegetarians.
Right.
I'm using this as an example because the right would have an active incentive to say that meat is in of itself very healthy because it goes against vegetarianism. And no left-wing professor would ever write an article at the health benefits of meat. And so once you get into politics that are this adjacent to science, it's impossible to have opinions that don't agree with a pre-existing narrative. And there's just way too many examples of the science being skewed where, remember that Ice Age genetics they found in Britain, just from like 10,000 years ago or 7,000 years ago. They did a DNA analysis of a bone from Britain, and they said the person was black. And the actual data set is there was a 2% chance it was black, and an almost all chance that it was someone who had an olive skin tone, North African, Mediterranean. And I knew that someone in Britain 7,000 years ago would not be black, because that just doesn't make sense with everything I know about human genetics. But it was years until someone disproved it. I think there's loads of stuff like that lying around.
Yeah. It's like that phrase, a lie can travel around the world before the truth even gets its shoes on. Yeah,
exactly. For you, what's the most cringe example of the science being faked that you've seen?
So it's a tough area to talk about because the best examples of that are also the ones that are the most politically charged and dangerous to talk about publicly. But
I know which one you're talking about.
Yes, there's maybe two there one could talk about. But basically, it's the combination of it was the marriage of blank slateism with the idea that like evolution proceeded only from the neck down for humans until for the period of history that everyone cares about until a million years ago or whatever. And that's just not true. It doesn't mean that like necessarily that people are better or worse than each other, but people are not interchangeable. They have different limits and different constraints based on the lineage they belong to, just like any other animal does.
And given my background in medieval philosophy, I often that's a topic I've studied a lot, is that there are so many things that are just complete facepalm, where if you told someone in the Middle Ages, they would say, yeah, you're an idiot for not realizing that. That's completely obvious. But it took us a bunch of studies. And one of the least favorite things is the obsession with sources, because I think sources are useful. I source all the books that I pull my ideas from. But when you say, for example, women are more agreeable than men, and someone says source, and the source is reality. Go outside. And a lot of what's happened is the removal of any sort of coherent shared reality and these very obtuse games about pretending to not know things that you don't know. And I was watching a debate between my friends at the Sitch and Adams podcast and Destiny, where my friend who's a centrist said left-wingers have a tendency to believe conservatives are greedy racists. And the leftists were like saying like, no, we don't believe that. And I was thinking, no, of course you guys believe that. We all know that. If we all played a real game here and understood, if we were actually talking about a shared reality, we could agree to that and move on. In the same way that I would say conservatives often view leftists as insane demon worshippers. And so, but the thing is, you can't have this any degree of a shared conception of these are just reasonable things. And so we play this obtuse game of pretending to not know things that are obvious.
One final question I want to ask for you. You mentioned when we were talking about the science, you were saying that the science is a reflection of the managerial class's interests.
Yeah.
My question for you is, why is the managerial class in the U.S. so interested in questions related to things like gender and sexuality?
Yes. The managerial class draws its right to rule from women. And that's partly because women are easier to use in the interconnected machinery that is industrial civilization. Industrial civilization is predicated upon the large cooperation of very large groups of people. And what that needs is people who are compliant, they don't fight back, that they follow rules easily, and women fit that category much better than men do. And so
you're just saying that if you measure the big five personality traits between men and women score higher on agreeableness and things like that.
Exactly. And so women operate in industrial civilization more easily than men, because industrial
they create less friction for the machine.
Exactly. And also, this is completely not politically correct, the managerial class demands permanent bureaucratic growth in order to keep the bureaucracy growing. And women will always find more social issues for the managerial class to work on, in that women signal status through consumption. And so they will always find a new issue to appeal to the managerial class to grow the managerial class's bureaucratic bloat.
Mm-hmm. Well, don't men signal status through consumption as well?
Men signal status through responsibility, and the consumption is a side effect of the responsibility. If there's there's this archetype of the tech CEO who's a multimillionaire, but he lives in a house with no furniture. And he is a respected figure in male circles. The female equivalent to that is not respected by her friends.
Interesting. Well, I know that you're getting a little strained. We've been talking for a while, Rudyard. Really glad that you sat down with me.
Of course.
You've got an interesting mind that connects a lot of disparate areas together in interesting ways. Is there anything that you want to reiterate from what we discussed today that you think, maybe we should get across clearly, or just any final thoughts you want to leave people with?
No, you run a great podcast. Congratulations on putting this together.
Thank you. And I don't know, do you want to tell people who don't know who you are, what your channel is, and what you're all about?
Yeah. I run the YouTube channel whatifalthist. I have a side channel called History 102 where we cover various historic time periods, and all of the content is free on YouTube if you guys want to check it out.
Yeah, he's got a lot of really cool stuff there that's pretty unique. So Rudyard Lynch, thank you for your time, man.
Of course. Thank you. Peace.